Very much in favour of the cross-party relationship in relation to the bill. I do have grave concerns about one aspect of the bill. My bill, or my amendment to the bill, or indeed the 2016 bill as it originally stood last week, before it was the victim of political theft. It's very interesting that Fianna Fáil are sitting here, or representatives of Fianna Fáil are sitting here, and it is a completely different bill from the one that Jim O'Callaghan brought in. I had an aspect of the bill for the first time that would give the court discretion to decide on a set tariff that must be served before parole can be considered for the offence of murder, and only murder. That's what it was, no more and no less. And I do not agree with the part of the bill, eligibility for parole, that has been radically altered. In fact, section 24 is gone, or it is certainly unrecognisable, and it has been rewritten extremely badly because much of it cannot be understood. The most serious section of the bill, as I read it a week ago, has been erased. Let me say it again. The omitted section. When imposing sentence upon a person, a sentencing judge may impose a specified period during which that person shall not be eligible for parole in relation to first-degree murder, which is a filmic term, I know. That's eradicated, gone away, magicked away, and I was led to believe that my criminal justice discretion amendment bill would be somewhat dealt with in this parole bill. Okay, and I was informed by the Irish Penal Reform Trust that this section had been deleted, and as I told you, they informed me with great glee while they were lobbying for their amendments. And they were telling me that we must make communities safer and we must use prisons sparingly. They believe in early prison release system in Ireland. They believe that all aspects of parole should be transparent, fair and coherent. And I believe that too. But political cowardice, in my opinion, has won the day by virtue of the galloping hordes of those with offender anxieties of biblical proportions. Not offenders themselves, funny enough, who I have worked with down through the years. They nonetheless stand in locus offendus for those barbarians who ruin families and communities because of murder. The net effect of this recent legislative evisceration is very simple. If we accept this bill as it currently stands, whereby the court may, under no circumstances, hand down or even recommend a set tariff to be served in a mandatory life framework, we are saying one thing and one thing only. And here's what we're saying. We are saying that our judges should have zero discretion within the mandatory life framework when it comes to the most heinous of crimes. The political theft of this simple but effective section by Fine Gael means that, and Fianna Fáil, who acquiesced, we have now given legislative imprimatur to a transfer of what is a blindingly obvious judicial function, sentencing, into the hands of the parole board. Sentencing should be transparent, fair and coherent. It is not. When it comes to murder, it is uncertain. For murder, there is a mandatory life sentence, but it does not mean life. And I was asking that a judge, when imposing a sentence upon a person, a sentencing judge may impose a specified period during which that person shall not be eligible for parole. That's all I was saying in relation to murder. Willful, powerful, violent, purposeful murder. Fine Gael are afraid. I think you're afraid. You're actually afraid of making real and genuine decisions. Penal Reform Trust trying to tell you and me what to do, sociologists telling me and everybody else what to do, academics writing papers telling me and everybody else what to do, and in the end bravery gets lost. And Fianna Fáil are worse. Because if I asked Jim O'Callaghan's bill, which is now unrecognisable, and they were jumping up and down praising it, and if I was to ask any Fianna Fáil representative, could they tell me the difference between Jim O'Callaghan's bill as it came in here and the bill as it stands today, I bet they wouldn't pass that exam. Now we have a parole board, and they're a committee minister. That's what they are. An executive, a committee, qualified, yes, but a minister in the form of a committee. The minister has no power, no hand, no part, and his role is over, and our role has been taken away. It is the handover to the executive. It is happening everywhere. Individual voices getting lost. The Irish Penal Reform Trust campaign for the implementation of a statutory parole system, fully independent of political control, and they've got their way. They should be here. They're now at ministerial level. No one here is responsible. There's no minister responsible anymore. The executive, the parole board, is now responsible for everything to do with release. The buck stops with them, and we all know what happens when committees are in charge. When the executive is in charge, there is no baseline accountability. And I know the answer. The parole board is now a kind of government of itself. There is no corner of mindless liberality to which this organisation will not go to ensure offender-led justice. So are we saying now that the offenders are running the system and the victims are to be left hurling from the ditch? Because that seems to me what's happening. Are the great voices to be silent by the executive? Executives don't get blamed. They're the system, and the system is never wrong, and it's always a place to hide. And what are the victims? What of the victims? We had hundreds, met hundreds of the victims of murder, families whose children, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, their impacted lives, their feelings, their intellect, and the internal, eternal damage, the death of their sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, or parents. But the Irish Penal Reform Trust is very concerned about the potential impact of victim input on parole outcomes. They say, and I quote, "Where submissions by victims are permitted, the legislation should provide for what can be included." I think Senator Bacek, who was one of the people involved in developing the whole area of victim impact statements, should look very carefully at that. Who thought it was a good idea to get rid of my section in the bill? Who believes it's right to ignore the victims of murder, or to not allow a judge imposed a specified period during which that person shall not be eligible for parole? What this bill in its current state is saying within my section is that our judicial system is one purely based around reform and not around punishment, any kind of punishment. And there's something wrong with you if you mention the area of punishment. And no judge is allowed to even suggest such a specified period, even with the gravest crime of the willful violence of the taking of a life. Even when I argue like this, people don't believe. I was an educationalist all my life. I believe totally in rehabilitation. I believe totally in change. I've atoned most of my life for my own sins and forgiven the sins of others in relation to my own life. But I also believe in equality before the law. And the Irish Penal Reform Trust were writing again to me today to point out to me why I was so wrong. Keep referring throughout their entire summary of the bill and their subsequent lobbying about clarity, transparency and fairness. It's like, as I said, the memorare going through all their arguments. Every second sentence is clarity, transparency and fairness. Well, where is the clarity, transparency and fairness for the victims? Where is it? Because it's certainly not in mandatory life sentences in relation to certainty. It is not there. One of the victims said to me, "Justice will never happen for us because nobody ever believes that murder will happen to them." And you know why they don't believe it? Because it's too ugly. And they will never believe it comes their way. And I was offering that as a clarity, transparency and fairness under the auspices of certainty in that section. That's all I was offering. You cannot have clarity without certainty. You cannot have transparency without certainty. And you certainly can't have fairness without certainty. The government appears, in my opinion, in this instance, in this section of the bill, entirely incapable of walking even a few centimetres in the shoes of homicide victim families and the communities from which they come. Are you so lacking in any kind of emotional and legislative maturity that until you hold maybe your own son or daughter in a morgue, having been brutally murdered at the hands of awful violence, that you're incapable of understanding that offender-led justice means only one thing: victims for the criminal classes. I am speaking about murder. I feel you lack bravery, and I am very questioning now my certain loyalty to Fine Gael, which I've had all my life. I saw the lack of judgment yesterday with the farmers. I'm seeing the lack of judgment in health. I'm seeing the lack of judgment in housing. I'm just seeing it generally. But it came to my door because I am the patron of Advic, and I have spent years with people who are destroyed forever with what has happened to them. And we are coming down with legislation for the offender. Coming down with it. I am hundreds of files in my room about it. But I want to see the same amount of equality and the same amount of balance for the offended in relation to first-degree murder. I'm not talking about anything else, and I don't want to get involved in anything else because that's for the judiciary and all else. Neither I nor my colleagues on Advic, nor the wider group of families who have lost members to violent murder, or indeed the Irish public, will sit idly by anymore when we open the paper every day to be met with violent murder. This terrified Oireachtas, you're terrified, continues to make a mockery of the lives of innocent victims. But I'll ask the question is, who decided that somebody's life is worth 17 years? Who decided that? I mean, in the 90s it was nearly 12 years, and before that was nearly 7 years. Like, who's deciding this? And what I was trying to introduce was the whole area of certainty around what Senator Batchik speaks about. Mandatory life sentence, maybe life, and notionally life for the rest of your life, but it is actually not. And maybe that is the problem. That is the core choking problem, to get rid of that, because there are degrees of murder. I don't like to use that word, degrees of murder. I think it's...
But in the US, that's right.
Yes, and therefore they wouldn't all have this mandatory life sentence, absolutely. And I also want to say that there's the whole area of consecutive and concurrent sentencing that needs to be looked at. That is enormous. Like, if two people get burnt or killed, which life sentence are you doing, you know? I mean, we have many victims of that, families of that in Advic. And I won't stop. I will continue to stand up for victims in whatever way I can, that the law does equalise. It is trying very hard. And there is this bill. I am delighted with aspects of this bill. And I am personally delighted at the parole rising from 7 years to 12 years, which does give certainty to families of victims. But I will continue to speak for them. Just standing up for the victims of this appalling crime, and I'm disappointed that it was magicked out of the bill. When I was actually arguing it up here in the upper house, it was being obliterated in the lower house.